So Donald Trump threatened to shut down Canada's access to American pipelines. He said he'd choke off every route Canadian oil uses to reach global markets. It was supposed to be the ultimate leverage play, the one threat Canada couldn't survive. And instead of surrendering, instead of coming to the table with concessions, instead of doing anything that Washington expected, Mark Carney did something that is already reshaping the global energy map. He announced a $153 billion energy transformation package designed to make sure Canada never needs those pipelines again. New refineries, critical mineral processing plants, LNG export terminals on both coasts, a national east-west pipeline, and electrical grid connecting every energy-producing province to every energy-consuming province, a green hydrogen export industry that doesn't exist yet but will within 5 years. $153 billion, the largest peacetime public investment in Canadian history, and every single dollar aimed at a single irreversible goal, making American energy leverage over Canada permanently obsolete. Warren Buffett called it the most consequential energy investment by any Western nation in a generation, and then he explained why Trump's pipeline threat didn't just fail, it funded the exact outcome Trump was trying to prevent. When you hear what each pillar of this package actually builds, how the backfire works mechanically, what Buffett says about stranded American assets worth billions that are about to lose their reason to exist, and what this means for gasoline prices across the American Midwest, you'll understand why this isn't a trade story. This is the story of how a threat produced the precise opposite of its intended effect. Subscribe now because this changes everything. Let me start with what Trump was betting on, because the logic of his gamble is important to understand before you can appreciate how completely it backfired. Canada exports 4.3 million barrels of oil per day. That makes it the fourth largest oil producer on Earth. And 97% of those exports, 97% go to the United States, flowing through American-controlled pipeline infrastructure, the Keystone System, Enbridge Line 5, which crosses under the Straits of Machino in Michigan, Line 3 running through Minnesota and Wisconsin. These pipelines are the arteries of Canada's energy economy, and every single one of them passes through American soil, under American jurisdictions, subject to American regulation and American political decisions. Alberta's economy alone depends on $120 billion in annual oil revenue, and virtually all of it flows through infrastructure that the United States government can regulate, restrict, or shut down with an executive order. Saskatchewan, British Columbia, Finland, all have significant energy sectors, all dependent on the same southbound infrastructure. Trump's calculation was straightforward, blunt, and seemingly irresistible. Threaten to restrict pipeline access, and Canada has to comply with whatever trade demands are on the table. He even said it publicly at a press conference in the East Room. If Canada doesn't want to deal fairly, we'll shut down every pipeline they depend on. Let's see how long they last. His advisors reportedly told him it was the most powerful piece of leverage any American president has ever held over Canada. And on paper, they were right. Canada was a captive supplier with a single customer, no meaningful alternative export routes to global markets, no domestic refining capacity worth mentioning, no east-west pipeline connecting Alberta's massive production to eastern Canadian demand. The entire energy infrastructure of the country pointed in one direction, south, and the keys to that infrastructure were held in Washington. It looked like checkmate. It looked like the one threat Canada couldn't escape. But here's what Trump didn't understand, and it's the single most important detail in this entire story. Canada's dependency wasn't a fact of geography or geology. It was a failure of infrastructure, a failure of political will. For decades, Canadian governments had talked about building alternative export routes, building domestic refining capacity, building an east-west energy backbone that would connect the country's western energy resources to its own eastern population. Think tanks published papers about it. Economists modeled it. Industry leaders proposed it. But the political will was never there. Alberta resisted federal energy policy on principle. Ottawa didn't want to fight the provincial battles. The oil industry preferred the certainty of American pipelines even at discounted prices to the risk and expense of new infrastructure. The dependency was a choice, a bad choice, but a choice that nobody had enough political motivation to reverse. And then Donald Trump came along and provided something no Canadian politician had ever been able to provide on their own. A reason that every province, every premier, every energy company, every environmental group, and every voter in Canada could agree on. He provided the threat. He made the cost of dependency concrete, visceral, and impossible to ignore. When a foreign president stands at a podium and says he'll choke off your country's primary source of revenue, the abstract arguments about energy diversification suddenly become very, very real. The editorial boards that had been debating the merits of east-west pipelines for 20 years stopped debating. The provincial premiers who had been fighting each other over federal energy policy stopped fighting. The oil executives who had resisted change because the status quo was profitable enough stopped resisting. Trump unified Canada's fractured energy politics in a way that no Canadian leader ever could, and the threat became the catalyst for a transformation that had been economically justified for decades but politically impossible until this moment. Carney made the announcement in Edmonton, not Ottawa, not in the federal capital surrounded by bureaucrats and diplomats. In Edmonton, the capital of Alberta, the beating heart of Canadian oil country, he stood at a podium flanked by 6 provincial premiers, and the person standing closest to him was the Premier of Alberta, a conservative politician who has spent most of her career opposing federal energy policy, fighting Ottawa on carbon taxes, and championing the oil industry's right to operate without federal interference. The fact that she was standing next to Carney publicly endorsing a $153 billion federal energy package tells you everything about how completely Trump's threat changed Canadian politics. When the Premier of Alberta stands with a federal prime minister and says we need to build our way out of American dependency, the ground has shifted beneath the entire political landscape. And it shifted because Trump made the cost of the status quo more terrifying than the cost of change. The package is called the Canadian Energy Sovereignty and Transformation Act, CESTA. 5 pillars, 10 years, $153 billion, and each pillar targets a different dimension of Canada's energy dependency on the United States. The first pillar is critical minerals processing, and it's worth $42 billion. Canada sits on the world's 3rd largest reserves of lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth elements. These are the materials that power every electric vehicle battery, every smartphone, every semiconductor chip, and every advanced military system on the planet. They are, by any reasonable analysis, the oil of the 21st century. But here's the absurdity that CESTA fixes. Canada has been exporting these raw minerals for processing elsewhere, shipping unrefined lithium to the United States and China, where it gets processed into battery-grade material and sold at enormous markup to the global market. Canada has been selling the world raw ingredients, new refineries, smelting facilities, battery-grade lithium production plants, nickel sulfate facilities, rare earth separation complexes. The target is processing 80% of Canadian critical minerals domestically within 8 years. Currently, that number sits at roughly 50. The transformation is staggering in its ambition, and the strategic implications go far beyond economics. Canada just positioned itself at the center of the supply chain that every advanced economy on Earth depends on. The second pillar is LNG and hydrogen export infrastructure, $38 billion. This is the export diversification play, and it strikes directly at the heart of Canada's single customer problem. The money builds a massive expansion of LNG export terminals on both coasts. LNG Canada Phase 2 in British Columbia, plus 2 additional Pacific terminals, a new Atlantic facility in Nova Scotia, an expansion of capacity at St. John and New Brunswick, green hydrogen production facilities powered by Canadian hydroelectricity, genuinely clean energy exported in a form that Europe and Asia are desperate to buy, direct export relationships with Rotterdam, Hamburg, Yokohama Inc., and Mumbai and Singapore. Canada currently sends 97% of its energy exports to the United States. CESA targets reducing that to under 60% within a decade, and the economic logic is devastating in its simplicity. For decades, Canada has been selling its natural gas and oil to a single customer at captive market prices. The Western Canadian Select Discount, the difference between what Canadian oil sells for and what it would sell for on the global market, has cost Canada somewhere between $15 and $20 per barrel for years. Multiply that by millions of barrels per day, year after year, and you begin to understand the scale of the wealth that Canada has been leaving on the table, because it had no alternative customers. Countries with one customer accept whatever price they're given. Countries with dozens of customers set their own price. This pillar creates the dozens of customers. The third pillar is domestic refining capacity, $31 billion. And this is the pillar that exposes what might be the single most absurd element of Canada's current energy economy. Canada is the 4th largest oil producer on Earth. It produces 4.3 million barrels every single day, and yet, and this part genuinely defies belief, it exports raw crude to American refineries in Texas, Illinois, and Louisiana, and then buys back refined petroleum products at a markup. Gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, products made from Canadian oil, refined in American facilities, and sold back to Canadian consumers at a premium. Think about how ridiculous that is. It's like a wheat farmer shipping his entire harvest to a neighbor who mills it into flour and bakes it into bread, and then the farmer drives to the neighbor's store and buys the bread back at 3 times what he was paid for the wheat. CESTA ends the absurdity. 2 new refineries in Alberta, 1 in Saskatchewan, expansion of the existing Irving refinery in New Brunswick. The target is refining 60% of Canadian crude domestically within the decade, up from roughly 30% today.
The billions in annual refining margin that currently flow to American companies will stay in Canada. Canadian consumers will buy Canadian refined fuel made from Canadian crude, and the economic leakage that has defined this relationship for half a century stops. The fourth pillar is the East-West energy backbone, $27 billion. This one fixes a problem so basic it's almost embarrassing that it hasn't been fixed before. Right now, Canadian energy flows north-south toward the United States. Western provinces produce far more energy than they consume. Eastern provinces, Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, consume far more than they produce. And because there's no adequate east-west infrastructure connecting them, Eastern Canada actually imports energy from the United States. Ontario buys American natural gas. Nova Scotia imports American electricity. Canadian provinces buying American energy, while other Canadian provinces sit on massive surpluses they can't get to them. The energy backbone fixes that permanently. A new national pipeline and upgraded electrical grid connecting Alberta and Saskatchewan to Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces. Alberta crude flowing east to Canadian refineries instead of south to American ones. Quebec's hydroelectric surplus flowing to Nova Scotia instead of being exported at discount to New England. The backbone strengthens the entire Canadian grid, reduces domestic energy costs, and removes yet another vector of American leverage. The fifth pillar is clean energy technology export, $15 billion. This is the future play. Hydro-Quebec expansion for European electricity export through undersea cable partnerships that are already in preliminary engineering, small modular reactor technology development and international licensing, hydrogen fuel cell technology, advanced battery technology, energy storage R&D. Canada isn't just building infrastructure for today's energy market. It's building an energy technology export industry that will generate revenue for decades after the oil transitions to something else. It positions Canada not as a resource colony exporting raw materials, but as a global clean energy technology leader. The distinction is everything. Resource exporters are price takers. Technology leaders are price setters. Total $153 billion over 10 years. Funded through a combination of sovereign wealth reallocation, federal budget allocation, provincial matching funds, green bond issuance, and private sector co-investment leverage by tax incentives for a $2.2 trillion economy. It comes to about 0.7% of GDP annually, significant but entirely manageable. And here's the number that makes the entire investment make economic sense without any debate whatsoever. Canada currently loses an estimated $18 to $22 billion per year in discounted energy pricing, lost refining margins and pipeline transit fees because of its dependency on the American market, $153 billion over 10 years. The dependency costs roughly $200 billion over the same period. This investment doesn't just pay for itself, it generates a return. It was always the rational economic decision. It just needed the political catalyst, and Trump provided it. And then Warren Buffett weighed in. And his response didn't just validate Carney's strategy, it reframed the entire US-Canada energy relationship in terms that made Wall Street collectively realize how badly American interests had been damaged by their own government's actions. He was at a Berkshire Hathaway energy subsidiary event in Iowa. When someone in the audience asked about CST, Buffett paused longer than usual before answering. People in the room said there was a strange expression on his face. Not concern, not alarm, but something like vindication. And then he said something that surprised everyone. I've been waiting for someone to do this for 20 years. He explained what he meant. The Canadian energy discount, he said, has been the most irrational pricing arrangement in global commodity markets for as long as he's been paying attention. A country with the third largest oil reserves on Earth selling at a $15 to $20 per barrel discount because it built all its pipelines pointing in one direction. That's not bad luck, that's bad infrastructure. And what Mr. Carney just announced is the fix that the market should have demanded decades ago. The only question is why it took a geopolitical crisis to trigger what basic economics should have corrected on its own. He called SESTA the most consequential energy investment by any Western nation in a generation. Not because of the dollar amount, though he acknowledged that $153 billion is serious money by any standard, but because of what it transforms structurally and permanently.
Canada goes from a captive supplier with one customer to a global energy power with dozens of customers. He said that's not an incremental change. That's a phase transition. And in my experience, phase transitions in energy markets don't reverse. Once the infrastructure exists to sell to the world, you don't go back to selling to one buyer at a discount. The economics don't allow it. Buffett then offered a perspective that only someone who has run energy businesses for decades could provide. He talked about Berkshire Hathaway Energy, one of the largest energy utilities and pipeline operators in the United States, and how the company has been modeling Canadian crude flow scenarios for years. We've always known this dependency was fragile, he said. We've always known that one political shock could trigger the investment that eliminates it. We just didn't know when the shock would come. Now it's come, and the consequences for American energy assets are going to be severe. Then came the warning that American energy executives need to hear urgently. Buffett pointed out that dozens of American refineries concentrated in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast are configured specifically to process heavy Canadian crude. That's what they were built for. That's what their catalytic crackers and coing units are designed to handle. That's what they've been running on for decades. When Canada builds domestic refining capacity and LNG export terminals that redirect crude to global markets, the raw material that currently flows south through American pipelines stops flowing south. Those American refineries don't just lose a supplier, they lose the specific grade of crude they were engineered to process. Retrofitting a refinery for a different crude type is extraordinarily expensive, hundreds of millions per facility. For some, especially older ones operating on thin margins, it won't be economically viable. They become stranded assets, billions of dollars in infrastructure built on the assumption that Canadian crude would flow south forever. That assumption just received a $153 billion death sentence. American pipeline companies face the identical structural problem. Enbridge, TC Energy, every company that earns transit fees from Canadian crude moving through American soil, their revenue models, their stock valuations, their debt covenants, their long-term financial projections, all of it depends on Canada's dependency continuing indefinitely. SESTA eliminates the dependency on a published timeline with allocated funding. Those pipeline assets are repriced the moment the market fully internalizes that the crude is going somewhere else. Buffett put it with characteristic directness. Trump threatened Canada's energy dependency. Carney's response was, "You're right. That is a dependency. Let me eliminate it." And the elimination doesn't just end Canadian dependence. It strands American assets worth tens of billions of dollars that were built on the assumption the dependency would last forever. The assumption is dead. The assets built on the assumption will follow. And then he offered the broader philosophical frame that pulls the entire story together. This is what I've tried to explain to people about leverage in business for 60 years. He said leverage only works as long as the other party can't escape. The moment they find an escape route, your leverage doesn't just disappear, it becomes a liability, because now they're not just independent, they're independent and motivated to never be in that position again. That motivation is permanent. That's what makes this irreversible. He paused, then delivered the line that will define this entire episode. You don't threaten someone into compliance, you threaten them into independence. And independence once achieved is permanent. The backfire is already visible in specific, concrete, measurable ways across the American energy sector, and the scale of the damage is only beginning to register. Pipeline stocks dropped on the day of the CST announcement. Not a minor dip. Significant declines across every company with Canadian crude transit exposure. Enbridge, which operates the largest pipeline network carrying Canadian oil into the United States, saw its shares fall 4% in a single session. TC Energy, which operates the Keystone system, dropped similarly. Analysts at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley immediately began revising long-term revenue projections downward, with one Goldman note estimating that SESTA could reduce Canadian crude volumes through American pipelines by up to 40% within a decade. For pipeline companies whose entire business model is built on volume, a 40% reduction isn't a setback, it's an existential threat. And here's the most bitter irony of all, the pipeline industry had actually lobbied in favor of Trump's pressure tactics against Canada. Industry trade groups publicly supported the tariffs. Pipeline executives held private meetings with White House trade advisors, arguing that tighter leverage on Canada would mean more crude flowing through their infrastructure at higher fees on more favorable terms. They believed that squeezing Canada would increase their bargaining power. Instead, the pressure they lobbied for created the very investment that makes their Canadian revenue stream obsolete. They asked for the weapon that was pointed at them. They funded the lobbying effort that destroyed their own future. The refining margin loss is equally devastating and far more direct in its impact on American consumers. American refineries, dozens of them concentrated in the Midwest and along the Gulf Coast, have been buying Canadian heavy crude at a built-in discount of $5 to $20 per barrel for years. That discount isn't a market anomaly. It exists for one reason and one reason only. Canada had no alternative customers. When you have a single buyer, you accept whatever price that buyer sets. American refineries understood this perfectly and they exploited it ruthlessly. They configured their facilities specifically for heavy Canadian crude because it was cheap and because they knew Canada couldn't sell it to anyone else. SESTA destroys that equation. With LG terminals on both coasts and global buyers in Europe and Asia, Canadian energy producers can demand global pricing for the first time. The Western Canadian Select discount, the gap between what Canadian oil is sold for and what it would sell for on the open market, evaporates. American refineries that have been getting Canadian crude at a $15 to $20 per barrel discount will now have to pay full market price, or they'll lose their supply entirely as Canadian crude gets redirected to Canadian refineries and global export terminals. That cost increase doesn't stay in corporate spreadsheets. It flows directly and immediately into the price Americans pay at the pump. Gas stations in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, Montana, Minnesota, Wisconsin. The states that depend most heavily on refined products made from Canadian crude are the states where gasoline prices will rise the most. In those states, every single one of them are states that voted heavily for Trump. The voters he claimed to be protecting, the communities he promised to revitalize, the working families he said his trade policies would help. Those are the people who will pay the price for his miscalculation every time they fill up their cars. The refinery stranding problem compounds the pricing problem. American refineries in the Midwest were built and configured specifically to process heavy Canadian crude, their catalytic crackers, their coing units, their distillation columns, all designed for a specific grade of oil. When that grade stops arriving because Canada is refining it domestically and exporting the rest globally, those refineries face an impossible choice: retrofit for a different crude type, which costs hundreds of millions of dollars per facility and takes years, or shut down. For older refineries that were already operating on thin margins, the economics of retrofitting may not work. They become stranded assets. Facilities that employed hundreds of workers, that anchored small-town economies across the Midwest, that seemed as permanent as the landscape itself, suddenly facing closure because the one assumption they were built on turned out to be wrong. And there's a dimension to this backfire that almost nobody in Washington has fully grasped yet, and it may end up being the most consequential of all. The critical minerals pillar of SESTA, the $42 billion investment in lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth processing, quietly transforms Canada into the gatekeeper of the materials that the United States desperately needs for its own economic future. America's green energy transition depends on lithium for EV batteries. America's defense supply chain depends on rare earth elements for advanced weapon systems. America's semiconductor industry depends on cobalt and specialized materials. All of these materials exist in abundance in Canadian soil. In Canada, under SESTA, will now process them domestically and sell them to global customers at global prices. Trump was so focused on 20th century energy leverage pipelines carrying crude oil that he completely missed the 21st century leverage shifting beneath his feet. By the time American manufacturers realize they need processed lithium and battery-grade nickel and rare earth oxides from Canadian facilities, and that Canada now has eager customers in Europe, Japan, South Korea, and India willing to pay premium prices and sign long-term contracts, the leverage equation will have completely and irreversibly inverted. Canada won't be the country dependent on American goodwill for pipeline access. America will be the country dependent on Canadian goodwill for the materials its own economy needs to function. The energy hostage just became the energy gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper sets the terms. Zooming out from the bilateral relationship, SESTA sends a signal that reverberates across the entire global economy. It tells every resource-dependent nation on Earth that generational economic transformation is achievable when the political catalyst exists. Even if that catalyst comes from an adversary's threat rather than from your own leadership. Australia, facing its own resource dependency pressures from China, is already studying the SESTA framework. Australian trade officials have requested briefings from their Canadian counterparts on the financing structure, the federal-provincial cooperation model, and the critical minerals processing pipeline. Middle Eastern states looking to diversify beyond petroleum are watching how Canada structured the combination of sovereign wealth, green bonds, and private sector co-investment. African nations that have been trapped as raw material exporters for generations, sending unprocessed minerals to be refined in Europe and China, then buying back finished products at enormous markup, are watching a mid-sized Western economy demonstrate that the raw export trap can be broken with the right investment and the right political moment. Canada just wrote the playbook for how a resource-dependent nation transforms itself into a value-added economy, and Trump, in one of the great strategic ironies of the 21st century, provided the political motivation that made the playbook possible. Without his threat, SESTA wouldn't exist. Without his attempt to weaponize Canada's dependency, the political coalition needed to break that dependency would never have formed. He tried to exploit the weakness. He ended up funding the cure. Meanwhile, the contrast with American energy infrastructure could not be more damning. While Canada invests $153 billion in new refineries, new export terminals, new pipelines, new processing plants, and new clean energy technology, American energy infrastructure continues its long decline. Refineries built in the 1960s and 1970s that haven't been meaningfully upgraded or expanded, pipeline networks under constant regulatory and legal pressure, an electrical grid so fragile it buckles under summer heat waves and winter cold snaps, producing blackouts that would be unthinkable in any other advanced economy.
A clean energy transition that stalls on political gridwork every election cycle, leaving billions in potential investments stranded in legislative limbo. America's energy dominance wasn't always like this. It was built on infrastructure investment, massive ambitious generational investment by leaders who understood that the country that builds the most controls the most. The interstate highway system, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the pipeline networks that connected the Gulf Coast to every corner of the continent. That was America at its best, building the future rather than threatening the present. Canada looked at that legacy and learned the lesson. America, it seems, forgot it. One country is building, the other is threatening, and history every single time without exception has favored the builders. So here's where we stand. Trump threatened to shut down Canada's pipeline access. He called it leverage. He called it the one threat Canada couldn't survive. And Canada's response was not to negotiate, not to capitulate, not to retaliate with counter tariffs or diplomatic pressure. Canada's response was to invest $153 billion in making the threat irrelevant. 5 pillars, each targeting a different dimension of the dependency Trump tried to exploit. Critical minerals processing $42 billion that makes Canada the gatekeeper of the materials the 21st century economy runs on. LNG and hydrogen export capacity. $38 billion that creates global customers and ends decades of selling at a captive market discount. Domestic refining $31 billion that stops the absurdity of the fourth largest oil producer on earth importing its own refined fuel. An east-west energy backbone $27 billion that connects the country to itself so that no Canadian province ever needs to buy American energy again, and clean energy technology export $15 billion that positions Canada for the decades beyond the oil era. Carney at the Edmonton press conference closed with words that every leader in Washington should hear. For too long Canada accepted a dependency that cost us tens of billions of dollars annually and left our economy vulnerable to the political decisions of another country. That era is over. Canada will trade with the world. We will sell our energy at fair prices to fair partners, and we will never again allow our economic survival to depend on a single customer, no matter how large, no matter how powerful, no matter how loudly they threaten. Buffett called it the smartest energy investment in a generation. He warned that American pipeline and refining assets built on the assumption of permanent Canadian dependency are becoming stranded assets in real time. Pipeline stocks are already falling. Refining margins are already under pressure. The Western Canadian Select discount, the pricing anomaly that has saved American refineries billions per year, is already beginning to close as global buyers line up, and the critical minerals leverage is quietly shifting northward, setting up a dependency reversal that could define the next 30 years of the bilateral relationship. The voters Trump claimed to be fighting for the energy workers in the Midwest, the pipeline communities in Montana and Minnesota, the refinery towns in Illinois and Indiana are positioned to bear the heaviest cost of his miscalculation. Higher gasoline prices, stranded refineries, pipeline revenue evaporating, jobs built on a dependency that their own president's threats destroyed, the cruelest irony in a story full of them. Trump pointed a gun at Canada's energy dependency. Canada looked at the gun, looked at the dependency and decided to eliminate both. The gun didn't fire. The dependency is dying. And $153 billion in new infrastructure already breaking ground, already funded, already supported by every major province and every major energy company in the country, is the proof that some threats don't produce surrender, they produce freedom.